If you're an AQA A-Level Business student looking for a video to revise Unit 7 Analysing Strategic Position, well, this video is for you. Now this video is a part 2 of 3 series, so if you haven't already, make sure that you watch part 1 because we're going to go through some important concepts that you need to know for your exam, including the different legislations that may impact businesses. We're also going to look at different economic factors such as exchange rates, inflation, interest rates. We'll also have a look at the difference between the fiscal and monetary policy. We'll then take a look at the difference between open trade and protectionism. And to finish off this session, we'll take a look at business ethics, including Carroll's CSR pyramid. Let's get into it. The first topic that we're going to take a look at in this revision video will be legislation. Now essentially, legislation is the laws that a business must follow and abide by, which would therefore mean they will impact their decision making. And our key laws will include the competition laws, labour market laws, and also environmental legislation. Starting off with our competition laws. Now, competition policy, it consists of laws that try to regulate markets to promote fair competition. They would want to look at preventing any monopolies from occurring. And what we mean by monopoly is that there's just one business in the market, they can exploit customers, so they can charge whatever prices that they want. So essentially what the competition policy does, it tries to protect consumers from anti-competitive practices, from businesses exploiting customers. So the idea is that customers have lots of choice, which is why regulators, they tend to block mergers and acquisitions, such as Sainsbury's and Asda, because in 2019 there was a proposed £7.3 billion merger between Sainsbury's and Asda, but this was actually blocked by the UK CMA, which is the Competition and Markets Authority. Essentially, this regulator ruled that the merger of Sainsbury's and Asda would reduce competition, and that could lead to higher prices over time, less quality and less choices for customers. Because they were particularly concerned about the impact the supermarket shoppers would have and on fuel prices. Now, even though it was blocked, Sainsbury's and Asda, they tried to plead their case saying, no, we're not going to increase our prices, but they was like, nope, we are not having it. So how does the competition laws impact businesses? Well, for larger businesses, it can seem a little bit annoying because a lot of their actions can be delayed because they need to make sure that the CMA, they need to make sure that they're abiding by these competition laws. And it can also reduce the barriers to entry. So for your smaller businesses, you're able to enter markets easier. And as we said, we are trying to promote competition. So there's more innovation happening, there's more competitive pricing. Now for your larger businesses, it can prevent some of the decisions that they make, but for your smaller businesses, it can be quite beneficial for them. Next up we have is our labour market laws. Now essentially, this is just protection for employees. These are laws that refer to how you treat your employees. So they are regulations that ensure fair treatment. They ensure that your employees aren't being exploited. They ensure that your employees, they have job security, for example. They also want to provide safe working conditions, so factors such as health and safety, and as I've said, around job security. Now what these labour market laws will cover, first of all, safe contracts. The reason why employees want safe contracts is because they want job security. They want a constant income. You can also help protect them against unfair dismissal. So you can't just fire an employee for the sake of it, and for a business, if you are removing the employees, you have to give them a period of notice time, because that notice period will help them actually go and find a different job. Of course, as well, around equal pay, we know there's still an issue about the gender pay gap, how males on average are earning more than females, but these labour market laws are looking to diminish that. Another key labour market law will also be about minimum wage, and finally protection from discrimination. Now the way labour market laws typically impact businesses is that it can increase their costs. Because for example, if we need to make sure that there are safe working conditions, we need as a business to be putting more health and safety protocols in place. And of course, if minimum wage is increasing, if we are originally paying our employees on that previous minimum wage, then we're still going to have to pay them an increase now because the minimum wage has gone up. And if we don't comply, there can be penalties, there can be fines for the business. Nevertheless, it can actually lead to happier employees because if they've got secure contracts, well, you're looking at the safety and security needs from Maslow's hierarchy. Health and safety is another important element of our labour market laws. And this just refers to the regulations that ensure workplaces are safe, protecting employees from hazards and accidents. So for example, this could include providing employees with protective clothing, safety training and proper equipment. But they also need to make sure that they're preventing any workplace violence, any bullying and excessive stress. And they also need to provide their employees with sufficient break time so employees aren't burning out and employees aren't feeling too stressed. Now the impact our health and safety has on a business, well, first of all, it can typically increase costs because we need to put those health and safety protocols in place. We need to get the right equipment. And if we don't do this, well, there's fines, there's penalties that we may face. But of course, that safe working environment, that's our safety and security needs met for the employees, which can make them happier and can start to help those employees meet the higher needs from Maslow's hierarchy. And the final type of legislation that we have is environmental legislation. Now, this is becoming more and more important over these recent years because it's becoming a bigger issue that some of these companies are having such a negative impact on the environment. So within the UK, businesses are now subject to report their greenhouse gas emissions and do what they can to minimise their environmental impact. Now, businesses, they must ensure they comply with environmental legislation. So, as we said, reducing their carbon emissions, reducing their environmental impact, reducing the amount of pollution. And the reason why they need to do this is to avoid fines and avoid penalties. And we've got lots of different environmental legislations. For example, the Environmental Protection Act of 1990. This regulates waste management and pollution control, once again, to protect the environment. We've also got the Clean Air Act of 1993, which controls air pollution by restricting emissions and smoke from industrial sources. Now, a great way of how we've seen change in legislations impacting businesses is looking at car manufacturers. Because in the UK, we have this new legislation in place that your car manufacturers, they're not going to be able to produce petrol or diesel vehicles after 2030. So a lot of these car manufacturers now are having to innovate, they're having to invest in product development to develop these electric vehicles, to develop vehicles that have zero emission. But of course, your companies like Tesla, well, they're looking at this and thinking, well, we've always been doing this. So in terms of the legislation changes, it can negatively impact businesses or it can help those businesses who have been thinking ahead of time. The next topic that we're going to take a look at in this revision video will be around government policy. Now, there's a couple of things that we need to look at, starting off with enterprise. Now, what we mean by the term enterprise is that it's the ability and the willingness to take risks of starting up and growing up a business. Now, when we look at government policy and how this could influence the level of enterprise that happens within a country, well, essentially, your government policy wants to be set up to encourage people to set up new businesses, to have an environment where entrepreneurs are supported, they're encouraged to set up their own businesses, to launch their own ventures, to encourage more innovation to happen. And we can see that in the UK, the government tries to set up policies that, once again, encourages enterprise. So over the past few decades, we can see in 1959, we were just shy of around 2 million people being self-employed, having their own company. Whereas in 2023, we can now see that's over 4 million people. Now, of course, this will be heavily influenced by population. But the problem is, over this last decade, we've seen that number begin to plateau. It hasn't actually really increased that much. And as well, definitely because of COVID-19, it took a massive hit. So that's why in 2020 you could see a bit of a dip within the number of people who are self-employed. Then the way government policy can be set up to try and promote enterprise, first of all, providing financial support. So this could be around government-backed startup loans. And with these loans, they could be at lower interest rates. They could offer grants or they could offer tax incentives for new businesses to help reduce their costs. And we could also look at non-financial support. So maybe around business mentorship, training programs and advisory services like those from the British Business Bank. Now, as part of our government policy, we also need to know about the role of regulators. But to start off with, well, what do we mean by regulation? Well, regulation, this refers to the rules set by the government to control business activities. And when we look at our regulators, well, they will be looking at enforcing these rules. So the idea is that these regulators, they would want to prevent monopolies, as we said from earlier. You want customers to have a lot of choice. You don't want a business to take over the market. We also want to make sure that we're regulating these companies who have a large market power. Because if these large companies who have a lot of market power started communicating with each other and said, well, how about we all just agree to increase our prices so all of us are making more profit? Now, if there are only 3 companies in that market, all 3 of them increase the prices, well, customers can't go elsewhere. So what these regulators would do is they would also try and limit the price increases by these businesses with significant market power. Now, they would also want to monitor financial businesses to prevent actions that could harm the consumers or destabilise the economy. Now, a great example of this is when the pesky banks and financial firms missold a load of people about PPI. They missold this to millions of customers because what they found out is that customers didn't actually need PPI. It was marketed as a way to cover loan repayments in obviously case of illness or employment, but many times these policies were unnecessary or they had unfair treatments. So the regulator action that happened because of this was from the FCA, the Financial Conduct Authority. Now, these ordered banks to refund affected customers, leading to billions, and I mean billions, in compensation. There was a 2019 deadline that was set for the claims, once again, just to encourage a bit quicker of these resolutions. And since then, stricter regulations have been put in place to prevent any mis-selling of these financial firms. And once again, how do these impact businesses? Well, they have to comply. And if they don't comply, there's going to be fines and there even could be legal consequences. And the final element of our government policy will be around infrastructure. Now, when we think of infrastructure, it's both the physical structures and as well the communication and the network structures. So if you was to go to a built-up city, there's lots of roads, there's lots of transport links such as trains. The communication, the Wi-Fi speeds are a lot quicker as well. First, if you go to areas such as the countryside, there's less of this. Now, what we mean by that infrastructure is transport utility and communication systems. Now, it's the government policies which basically influences how much spending goes into the infrastructure. And first of all, the reason why we want to have good physical infrastructure, well, first of all, it improves the business's efficiency and the speed of delivering products to customers. Because if we've got a lot of transport links, if we've got a lot of road networks, then it's going to be easier to send the products to customers. And not only that, it also makes it easier for employees to get to work. Just think, the amazing idea of HS2. And not only that, but we've also got our communication infrastructure. So this is your Wi-Fi speed. This is your ability to communicate digitally. Now, first of all, why this is important? Well, if you are an online business, you are a service business, it enables you to connect with your customers a lot quicker. Think, if you didn't have any Wi-Fi, you wouldn't be able to watch videos like this. And it just helps businesses overall with more efficient communication. Now, the reason why it's so important to invest in infrastructure is that it helps businesses operate. It helps reduce their operational costs. So in countries where the infrastructure isn't that good, it's less appealing for businesses to expand there. The next topic of this revision video that we're going to take a look into is actually introducing three concepts. Introducing what GDP is, taxation and inflation. Starting off with, what on earth is GDP? Well, GDP stands for Gross Domestic Product, and it's the total value of all goods and services produced in a country over a specific period of time. We typically use this to measure our country's economic performance. Now, when it's increasing, that means there is more spending, more money is being made by businesses. Now, the way you need to think of it, imagine that I have the world's largest shopping till, and I've scanned through every product that is ready and to be sold for final consumption. I scan all my products through and I have a big long receipt. Now, the total amount at the bottom of that receipt, that's what our GDP is equal to. Now, our GDP will influence the business cycle, and it looks something like this. Now, when we see GDP is growing, it means that the economy is growing, but we've got different phases. Starting off, we have the boom phase. Now, this is the period of rapid economic growth. We've got high demand, rising profits for companies, low levels of unemployment. Businesses, they expand, but now inflation may be starting to increase. Wage pressures may be beginning to increase. And what that could therefore lead to is a recession. Now, a recession is when we have 2 consecutive quarters of negative GDP growth. So within a recession, well, GDP declines, the level of demand falls, unemployment rises. The reason why unemployment rises is because businesses may have to make more employees redundant because they're facing lower levels of revenue. So they're having to invest less into the company. And then we have our trough. Now, this is the lowest point of the economic cycle. But what this does, this marks the end of a recession. But typically at this, demand, consumer confidence, they're at their weakest. but conditions are set for us to start to recover, to go into the recovery phase. So the economy, it starts to grow again. So level of demand begins to rise, employment levels begin to rise, businesses are investing more, they're making more money, they're retaining more, and then we have our expansion phase, a sustained period of growth where businesses increase their level of production, they're hiring more employees, people are earning more, people are spending more, demand goes up, and then the cycle continues again. Next up we have is our taxation. Now we all know what taxation is. It's what we have to pay the government from the money that we earn in one way or another. Now in terms of what the level of taxation is within a country, it depends on the fiscal policy. But the fiscal policy won't also do this. It will also influence the level of government spending. More on that though later on. Now as I said, what taxation is, it's the money that government get from the individual. So we earn a certain salary, but of course we don't see all of that because we have to pay income tax. And of course businesses, they have to pay tax, whether that's indirect or direct. Now the reason why tax exists is because the government needs money to invest into public services and infrastructure, even though it doesn't seem like that all the time. Now tax is typically separated into two categories. As we said, we've got direct tax. So this could be your corporation tax, so the amount of tax that a business has to pay on the profit they make. Or it could be indirect tax. So for example, with VAT, value added tax. So essentially what this is 20% of the revenue of the selling price that you charge for your customers. Now, if you want the level of government spending to increase, typically they would have to rise taxes. Now, this can impact us in very different ways. First of all, consumers, they will have less disposable income because the higher taxes, it reduces their take-home pay, leaving customers with less money to spend on products and services. It could also increase a business's cost because businesses may face higher tax on their profits. They may have to increase wages. They may have to spend more raw materials. And as well, prices could tend to go up. Because to cover the increase in costs, well, businesses don't want to just have less profit. So what they may do is they may increase their prices. And then that could obviously lead to inflation. And this leads me on to the last point of this section. What actually is inflation? Well, inflation is the rate at which general level of prices for goods and services begin to rise. So what this does over time, this reduces the purchasing power of money. You know, you may have been asked the question, what would you rather have, £500 today or £500 in 5 years' time? Well, the answer is I'd rather have the £500 today. The reason why is because £500 in 5 years' time might not be worth that much. Because if we look today, what could £25,000 buy us? Well, in terms of a house, you're lucky if that would even cover the deposit. But back 100 years ago, £25,000 could buy you a house up front. And the way we measure inflation is by using the CPI, the Consumer Price Index, which just examines the average change in prices customers pay over a period of time. So if inflation is higher, things are getting more expensive, so prices are going up. Now, generally, we've got three different reasons why inflation happens. First of all, we've got demand pull factors. So when a business experiences a high level of demand, they get a bit greedy, they want to make more money. So what they do is they tend to increase their prices. So whenever we see demand exceeding our supply, we want to make sure that we've hit that market equilibrium. We want to make sure that our supply equals our demand. So as we said, businesses raise their prices. We've also got cost push inflation, and this is when our production costs begin to increase. You know, maybe our suppliers, they've increased their prices. Maybe our employees, they're demanding higher wages. Now, as a business, once again, I don't just accept the fact that I'm going to have a smaller profit margin. I want to maintain my profitability. So if my costs increase, well, I'm going to have to increase my prices as a result of that. And the final reason is that the government may be printing off too much money. So essentially, we've got more money flowing around the economy. But if we've got more money flowing around, it makes money less valuable. So let's say, for example, I make everyone in the UK a millionaire, give everyone £1 million. Well, now being a millionaire isn't as valuable as it used to be. And businesses aren't going to just say, well, I'm going to sell my prices now for £5 still. They're going to increase all of their prices to a point where, once again, price levels begin to increase. So how does inflation then impact businesses? Well, as we've seen, well, inflation increases the price levels. So my costs may potentially be higher. And not only that, if we see that the general levels of prices are going up, your employees, they're going to be demanding higher wages as well. So typically, inflation can increase the business's cost. It could also reduce the level of consumer demand. We've got the law of demand, prices go up, level of demand typically goes down. But not only that, because if we find that everything is more expensive, consumers may have less disposable income. Now, depending on the income elasticity of demand of our product will influence how that change of income impacts our demand. And not only that, it just generally creates a level of uncertainty in the economy. So businesses, they may find it harder to plan. Now, in terms of how businesses will be impacted by inflation, well, simply it depends on how high inflation is. If inflation is extremely high, then businesses will be impacted a lot more than if inflation is really low. Typically, the UK set a target of around 2% inflation. The next topic that we're going to take a look at in this revision video will be exchange rates. Now, first of all, let's understand what exchange rates are. Quite simply, they are the value at which one currency can be exchanged for another. Because we've seen there's hundreds of different currencies around the world. We've got the pound, we've got the US dollar, we've got the euro, and so much more. But we want to know, well, what is the value exchange between them? But not only that, it will also change over time. So when a currency will strengthen, we call this appreciation. So the exchange rate begins to increase. My pound gets stronger against the US dollar, for example. However, if my currency weakens, we call this depreciation. So my pound now gets weaker against the dollar. And this is really important because when we look at how exchange rates impact businesses, we have an acronym that we need to remember. Now, in terms of what type of businesses this will impact, it will impact directly your importers and your exporters. So first of all, what's the impact on businesses if the pound was to get stronger? Well, remember the acronym SPICED. What it stands for, stronger pound, it makes imports cheaper, but it makes exports dearer. And when I talk about exports becoming dearer, I'm talking about the customer in the foreign market. So, how does this start to impact our importers? Well, first of all, as we said, stronger pound, it makes importing cheaper. So let me give you this example. Let's say at the moment, the exchange rate is £1 to $1.25. So if I'm a customer in the UK buying some trainers from America, now in America, the price tag is $150. When we convert that into the UK Great British Pound, I'm paying £120. But now, let's say the pound strengthens. Well, what does that mean? Well, what that means is that it makes importing cheaper. So for the very same pair of trainers, before when the pound was weaker, I'm paying £120. But now I only have to pay £100. So when building our chains of analysis, steal this one from me. So when we have a stronger pound, it becomes cheaper to import. So if you're a business, well, your import costs begin to lower. And that could help improve your profit margins, which of course leads to happy business owners. But the situation is not the exact same now for our exporting businesses. Because let's say, for example, I'm a UK exporter. I produce laptops and I sell them for £1,000. Now, if you're a customer in America, you're buying a laptop from me. Well, if my price tag is £1,000, well, converting that into US dollars, that's going to cost them $1,250. But now the pound strengthens. My currency is getting stronger against the American one. Well, your customers now have to pay more. They now have to pay $1,500. I still get £1,000, but they're having to pay more because my pound strengthened. So how does this stronger pound impact exporters? Well, it becomes dearer. Your exporting customers have to pay more money. And we know the law of demand is that if you increase the price, level of demand begins to fall. And if we have a lower level of demand, this would typically reduce our revenue, leading to very sad exporters. But what happens now when the pound gets weaker? Unfortunately, this acronym doesn't really roll off the tongue very well. It is WIPIDEC. Essentially, what this means for is that the weaker pound, your imports now become dearer. But for exports, it becomes cheaper. So let's break this down of how it impacts these businesses, starting off with our importers. Well, let's say, go back to the very same example from before. If I'm a customer in the UK, buying trainers from this American business, the trainers cost $150. In the exchange rate where £1 equals $1.25, well, I'm paying £120, but the pound's gotten weaker. £1 now can get exchanged for $1. So as a customer, the amount of price that I have to pay has increased. I now have to pay £150 to import that good from America. So when building our chains of analysis, let's say we're an importing business and we're buying in raw materials. Well, the weaker pound makes importing dearer. That would increase our business's cost, therefore reducing our profit margin. Very sad business owners from this. But what about your exporters? The situation now changes for them. Well, once again, let's go back to that example. We're a UK business. We're making those laptops, selling them for £1,000. So your customers in America, they're paying $1,250 for my £1,000 laptop. But the pound's weaker. £1 now can get exchanged for $1. Well, what does that mean for how much those American customers are paying? Well, they're now only paying $1,000. I'm still receiving £1,000. Well, now the weaker pound, your exporting becomes cheaper. So those foreign customers, those foreign businesses buying from you, your prices now appear cheaper to them. We know the law of demand. If we decrease prices this time, level of demand goes up, which should increase your revenue, and now we have happy business owners. The next topic that we're going to take a look at in this revision video will be the difference between fiscal and monetary policy. Now, not too long ago in this video, we did have a look at what fiscal policy is, but let's just have a quick recap. What fiscal policy is all about, it refers to the government's use of taxation. So what tax are they charging people? What tax are they charging businesses? Whether that's direct tax of income and corporation tax or indirect tax with VAT, because this will influence the spending in the economy. So as we said, if taxes go up, people have less disposable income, businesses have less to reinvest. Now, what the government should be doing with the taxes that they get is that they should be spending this on public services. Now, I think one of the best things about living here is the NHS, is the free National Health Service. I know it's not free in the sense that we have to obviously pay our money to obviously go into the funding for it, but we've got free healthcare. Not only that, it goes into the education system, goes into development of infrastructure, defence and welfare, and so much more. Now, in theory, if we see an increase in government spending, this could actually help boost the economy. So for example, let's talk about the development of infrastructure. Well, if we're developing infrastructure, potentially building new roads, new networks, well, they're going to have to collaborate with different UK businesses. So if different UK businesses now have more work, they're making more money, well, they're going to have to hire more people. So the level of employment begins to increase. But in order for them to spend more money, they need to make more money. But the way that they get this money is either through, well, increasing taxes, which could actually harm the economy, or they end up borrowing money. Now we've gone over what fiscal policy is. Well, what is monetary policy all about? Well, quite simply, your monetary policy is the process by which a central bank, and for us it's the Bank of England, controls interest rate and money supply. Now, the supply of money in monetary policy, this refers to the total amount of money available in the economy, including cash, bank deposits and other liquid assets. So the Bank of England, they will control the money supply through tools such as interest rates, such as open market operations. Now, increasing the money supply, it can simulate economic growth by encouraging people to borrow more and spend more. And the reason why we would want to decrease the supply of money is maybe to control inflation, maybe to slow down economic growth. Now, interest rate, this is an important concept and something that you guys should have already seen by now. Now, interest rates, they are a dual purpose. They have the cost of borrowing or the reward for saving. Let's look at the cost of borrowing. Now, essentially what we mean by the cost of borrowing, let's say I go to the bank and I want to borrow some money from them. So for example, I ask them for £10 million, but they say to me, well, you can borrow the £10 million, but we're going to charge you a 6% interest rate. So I get £10 million and I have to pay them £10,600,000 back. Well, that £600,000, that is the cost of borrowing and that's the interest rates. But as well, it's the reward for saving. So how this may work. Let's say I go to a savings account and they've charged me a very good interest rate of 6% in the savings account. So if I was to put in £100,000, after 1 year, in theory, I should have £106,000 back. The question we want to answer, well, how does the changing interest rates impact businesses? Well, first of all, if we increase the interest rates, well, what does that mean? Well, first of all, the cost of borrowing becomes more expensive. So less people, less businesses are willing to borrow more money. And not only that, think of people who have got a mortgage on a variable rate. Well, of course, they then have less disposable income. So the level of borrowing goes down. But not only that, the reward for saving increases. So people save more money. And if people are saving more money, once again, they are spending less money. But what about when we decrease interest rates? Well, if we decrease interest rates, the cost of borrowing goes down, making it cheaper to borrow money, which encourages people and businesses to borrow more money. And if people have more money, they spend more money. So we see the level of economic growth increasing. We see demand increasing. People stop saving as much because they want to save it because they're not rewarded as much. Now, not only that, interest rates can also impact our exchange rates. Now, when we see a higher interest rate, it means that the reward of saving increases. So when we look at these foreign countries and these foreign businesses, well, they look at the UK and think, well, if I put more money into the UK, I'm going to get more money back because the reward for saving increases. So what we tend to see is we see an increase in demand for our currency. And when we see an increase in demand for our currency, well, that makes our pound stronger. The next topic that we're going to look at in this revision video will be the difference between protectionism and open trade. First of all, before we go into what protectionism or open trade is, we need to know what imports and exports are. We looked at this a bit earlier on when we looked at our exchange rates. Well, quite simply, all we mean by imports is when within the UK, we are buying products or services from another country. So we're bringing them into the UK either for our own personal consumption or for resale. So for example, for resale, we may be importing raw materials from abroad. Now, this animation took me a while to make, so you guys are having the privilege to see it. If we are importing, the products and services are being brought into the UK. But what happens to the flow of money? Well, think if we are spending that money from a UK's perspective, the money is flowing out of the country. So if we are importing quite a lot, money is flowing out of the country, and that can negatively impact our GDP. But what about exports? Well, if imports are buying goods and services into the country, all exports are is when we build products and services within the UK and we sell it abroad. We sell it to these foreign markets. So again, going back to the amazing animation, we build the products and services in the UK and then we sell it abroad. But now, well, where is the money flowing? Well, of course, when we look at the flow of money, if we produce the products, people are spending it on our businesses in the UK. So the money is flowing into the UK. Now that's important because when we export, we're positively contributing to our GDP and our economic growth. So what's this concept then between free trade and protectionism? Well, first of all, when we look at free trade, this is when we are looking at exchanging goods and services between different countries without barriers, without these trade barriers, because we want to try and promote more open competition in these international markets. So we are able to sell our products freely without any trade barriers, without the protectionism policies such as tariffs and quotas. More on that in just a moment. And it can be quite a good thing, free trade, because we have access now to larger markets. And of course, if we are selling more products, this can increase our economies of scale, because as output increases, our unit costs should begin to reduce. And as well, because we've got more competition, we are potentially driving more innovation. And from a customer's perspective, well, I don't just have to shop at the businesses within the UK, I get to shop from businesses all around the world without the additional cost. But it can be a bad thing though, and that's why we have protectionism. Now, when we look at protectionism, this is when the government tries to restrict the amount of imports that the country is doing because they want to protect their domestic businesses. Because if you have these large businesses from all around the world, well, the problem is that if you keep buying from them over and over again because they've got better quality products than us, they can offer these cheaper prices. Well, the issue becomes is that no one wants to buy from our domestic businesses. And if the domestic businesses don't have any business, well, they don't hire any employees. And of course, if the unemployment rates begin to increase, the level of economic spending goes down. So what protectionism is there for is that the UK wants to protect UK domestic businesses from foreign competition. But the problem is it can promote trade wars. Because if I go to my neighbouring country and say, right, I'm going to put a protectionist policy against you, put in tariffs and quotas, well, they're going to look at me and say, well, I'm going to do the same thing again. So we don't actually have anyone importing or exporting that much from either of those countries. Now, we've got a few different forms of protectionism, starting off with our tariffs. Now, tariffs, think the first two letters, TA. They also are used when we talk about taxes. So all tariffs they are taxes imposed by a government on imported goods. Now, why we have tariffs? Well, one of two reasons. First of all, if you increase the price of these imported goods, we know the law of demands. As price goes up, demand should fall, so we are importing less. But for the goods that we are importing, well, it's a tax that is being put on top of it. So the government makes more tax revenue. So how this may look, Let's say I buy a watch for £100 from overseas, but now I have a 100% tariff to pay, so now I have to pay £200. Now that doesn't look like the worst thing in the world when we look at it from an individual perspective. But what happens now when we talk about it from a company perspective? Let's say I'm importing £10 million worth of raw materials. Well, if you plus the 100% tariff on now, that is going to cost me £20 million. So realistically, if the price of those imported goods go up, I may look elsewhere to buy those raw materials. I may look more domestically. And as we said, the law of demand states that if the price goes up, the level of demand should go down. But if you want to include a bit of evaluation in your answers of how effective tariffs can be, well, it depends on the price elasticity of demand, our favourite topic from Unit 3. Because we know if a product is price elastic, your customers are more sensitive to changes in price. So an increase in price causes a greater decrease in demand. So your tariffs become very effective. But if we look at our price inelastic goods, your customers are less sensitive to changes in price. The change in price causes a smaller proportional change in demand. So that increase in price from the tariff only causes a smaller decrease in demand. So it may be less effective on inelastic goods than it would be on price elastic goods. The next form of protectionism we have are also quotas. Now, quotas on the other hand, these are specific limits. Now this could be about the value or the quantity. So for example, if we're looking at a specific good, we could limit it to £100 million worth of imports. Or it could be a quantity, so we limit it to 50 million units that we could import. So an example could be, as we said, if we look at importing watches from China, well, if on average we're importing 1 billion each year, the government could say, well, we're going to limit that now to only 100 million. Now, how does this reduce the level of imports? Well, quite simply, you are forcing your customers and your businesses to move to different areas, to move to more domestic businesses. Because if I can't import those goods now from China, I'm going to have to still get those raw materials, potentially from those domestic businesses. And of course, that increases our domestic businesses' revenue and their market share. But not only that, if you're restricting the amount that a certain country can sell to yours, well, they may want to increase their selling price in order to still make a decent amount of money from that transaction. But once again, we know the law of demand. If their selling price increases, the level of demand typically falls. So what happens is those UK customers, those UK businesses, they start to look domestically. And we also have an extreme form of a quota, and this is what we would call an embargo. And all it means is we are completely banning any imports from that specific country. So potentially there's been a certain conflict that's happening in the world that your country is on the opposite side of. And the final form of protectionism that we can also have is our domestic subsidies. Now, what we mean by a subsidy is that this is financial support provided by the government to different businesses to try and reduce their costs and help them become a little bit more competitive. So in theory, your subsidies, they're not a direct form of protectionism because we're not restricting the amount that you can import, but instead you are trying to make your domestic businesses more competitive. But the problem is that if you are operating in this free trade market and other countries have seen that your government is giving loads of subsidies to your domestic businesses, well, they know why they're going to be doing that, so they may not be best pleased. So in terms of the different examples of subsidies, well, we could look at governments giving grants to businesses so they can look at spending that money on certain costs. We could also look at giving them tax relief, so reducing the amount of tax that they have to pay, and also giving them extremely low interest rates or zero interest rate loans. Now the idea is that these subsidies, they will help your UK businesses by protecting them from fierce competition and support your exporters by lowering their costs. Now in terms of what your company may spend those subsidies on, well, first of all, could be on reducing their production cost, could be on research and development, could be supporting employee wages and training programs, and so much more. The next topic that we're going to take a look at in this revision video will be seeing how different social changes impacts businesses and their decision making. Now, typically when we look at different social changes, it's going to impact the level of demand for certain type of goods. Some goods may be demanded more, some goods may be demanded less because of this. First of all, we've got factors such as demographic changes and population movements. Now we can see on this graph here is the change of the UK population from 1971 all the way up to 2023. So in 1971, you can see we're around that 55 million people in terms of our UK population, but in recent times we can see that starting to increase now closer to 70 million people. Well, how does that start to impact businesses? Well, larger populations, it just increases the potential market size because there's more people about now to buy your product or service, so demand could increase. And we're not just focusing on the population of the UK, this can also happen across the globe. So when we see certain countries and their population increasing, we may want to look at expanding into there. But whether this international market will be attractive or not depends on the type of product that we sell. Because let's say, for example, I'm a luxury business and I've seen a country where the population is increasing quite a lot. Now, the main thing that I would want to see about that country is the level of disposable income. Just because you've got a large population does not mean you also have a large disposable income on average. Another population change we have as well is an aging population. So what this means is there are a larger proportion of our elderly people. So certain products or services may benefit from this, such as healthcare, such as leisure. Now, the number of people aged 65 years and over increased from 9.2 million in 2011 to over 11 million in 2021. And the proportion of people aged 65 and over raised from 16.4% to now 18.6%. So we're getting more elderly people. People are living for longer on average. So certain businesses, as we said, who sell healthcare and leisure, which are targeted for these individuals, their market size is increasing, so their level of demand can increase. And not only that, but the population growth, an aging population, it increases the supply of labour because people are able to work for longer. There's more people to employ from. And typically when you have a greater supply of labour, it can actually decrease your labour costs. But not only that, having an aging workforce, people are working for longer, means they've got more skills. Another important social change as well will be around migration. Now, when we think about migration, it's simply the movement of people. When they are relocating, whether that's for education, whether that's to live there, and that could be internally, so just within your own borders, or it could be internationally, so across borders. So if we look at international migration, well, we find that we've got more of a cultural diversity. Now, how does that impact businesses? Well, the demand now for more diverse products and services begins to increase for these different cultural preferences. And this can provide opportunities for businesses that offer these type of goods. And not only that, when people migrate from their different areas across the world, they bring their culture with them, which mixes with the culture of the new location. So they may bring in new food and new drinks into that industry. And as well with international migration, it increases our population size. So once again, a greater supply of labour. Another key important social change as well is the changes in consumer lifestyle and our buying behaviour. Now, when we look at how we live today compared to how people used to live 50 years ago, you ask the question, how on earth did they survive without a mobile phone, without social media? Very easily, actually. But the changes in consumer lifestyle, we are using technology more and more. We're using more healthcare services. We're using more health devices to track our own personal data. So when we look at using technology more, businesses have to adapt to this. They have to implement technology into their operations. But not only that, the way we work has changed. So rather than going into the office, well, because of the development of technology, we get to work from home. So the way businesses operate will also change, and the demand for these type of products will also change as well. And I think the biggest social change that we've seen over the last few decades is the growth of these online businesses. Before you had to have an in-person shop. If you wanted to deliver a product or service, you had to do it in person. But now, people can operate online, and actually it's so easy to do this that the barriers to entry has decreased. So when we look at a decrease in the barriers to entry, there's more competition. It can also help reduce the business's cost. The reason why is that we have lower overheads, we have lower fixed costs such as rent and staffing, and it gives the businesses that operate 24/7. If you had an in-person store, well, the only times that store would be open would be when you have staff there. But online businesses with automation, they can operate all hours of the day. The only issue is that it can actually negatively impact these traditional businesses, these in-person businesses, because more people are shopping online rather than going in person. The next topic that we're going to take a look at in this revision video will be around corporate social responsibility. Now, first of all, we want to understand what corporate social responsibility is, then we're going to look at Carroll's CSR pyramid. But what actually is CSR all about? Well, essentially, CSR activities, it will typically cover environmental initiatives of a business, so a business becoming more eco-friendly. It will cover their ethical practices, so maybe becoming more socially responsible with people paying their employees fairly. It will also cover any philanthropic activities, so them giving back to communities, but they want to balance their social impact with their financial sustainability. So essentially, your business, it behaves like a good citizen. It goes above and beyond what is legally required of them, but they're still trying to be financially sustainable. Now, the aim with CSR is that we are trying to benefit all of the business stakeholders rather than just our shareholders. Now, after this, we're going to have a look at the shareholder versus stakeholder concept, where when we look at the shareholder concept, all about profit maximization, maximizing the wealth for our shareholders. But with the stakeholder concept, we want to benefit all of the business's stakeholders. And we do this by addressing our social and environmental concerns. So when we are making our decisions, we want to make sure that we're thinking, how can we have a positive impact with all the people around us, with all of our stakeholders, my customers, my local community, my employees, and as well thinking environmentally friendly. Now, a large part of corporate social responsibility is around business ethics. Now, what we mean by business ethics is doing what is right. Whereas when we look at corporate social responsibility, it's choosing to make a positive impact on society and the environment. When we look at CSR, it can increase the business's cost. So remember from Elkington's triple bottom line, the people, the planet and the profit. Well, if we look at people and planet, if we are caring more for them, well, that's going to increase the cost. More eco-friendly packaging, paying our employees a fair wage. So this could negatively impact our profit, but it could also increase our profit. Because if people see us engaging within these CSR activities, well, it could actually improve the brand's reputation. It could help attract more customers, so the business is making more revenue. And of course, if you are following these CSR activities, well, it could actually make your products more inelastic. Your customers are less sensitive to changes in price, so we have the ability to increase our price, potentially making a higher profit margin. So now we've covered what we mean by corporate social responsibility, it's time for us to take a look at Carroll's CSR pyramid. Now, you do need to remember this for your exams, you need to know the order as well. But essentially, Carroll's CSR pyramid is a framework that outlines the 4 key responsibilities that a business should consider when operating ethically and sustainably. And those are the ones that you can see on the screen. So the pyramid, it helps businesses balance profitability with their wider social and environmental duties. Now, at the foundation of the pyramid, we have our economic responsibilities, and these just refer to the business's duty to be profitable. Generating profits helps the business survive in the long term. It helps us create jobs, and it allows investment back into the business for innovation and for growth. Then we've got our legal responsibilities. So our legal responsibilities require businesses to operate within the law, comply with the regulations, comply with our employment, our labour laws, our consumer protection laws, our environmental legislation, and of course, tax. Now, by meeting our legal obligations, well, it just helps us avoid those fines and of course, our reputational damage. But now we want to start acting ethically. And remember, ethical responsibility, it goes above and beyond what is legally required. It helps encourages businesses to act fairly and morally. So this could include treating our employees well, sourcing our materials more sustainably, and considering the wider social and environmental impact that our business has. And at the very top of the pyramid, we have our philanthropic or philanthropic, depends on how you like to pronounce it. So this is when the business voluntarily gives back to society through charitable donations, community initiatives, and social projects. While these are not essential for a business to survive, these actions actually enhance the company's reputation and demonstrate a commitment to a social goal. Following up quite nicely from corporate social responsibility, we now need to take a look at the shareholder and the stakeholder concept. First of all, looking at the shareholder approach. Now, this was the more traditional way that businesses used to operate. Essentially, they wanted to benefit their shareholders. They wanted to maximize the wealth of their shareholders. Now, remember, a shareholder makes money in two different ways. The first one is through dividends, a share of the company's profit. And the second one is our capital gains. So the profit that they would make from selling their shares at a higher price than they originally bought it for. So when we are looking at the shareholder approach, we are just trying to maximize our shareholder returns. So this is really focusing on profit maximization, focusing on short-term performance. The reason why we want to focus on profit maximization, well, if they are making more profit, there's more dividends for the company to pay their shareholders. So whenever a business is making a decision, they ask themselves, will this benefit the shareholders? And this became a thing because traditionally, board of directors are hired by the shareholders of the business. Therefore, they should benefit those who have hired them. In turn, this would increase more investment of the business as more investors would be attracted to the company that is making lots of money. The problem is with the shareholder approach is that, well, it depends how you are making that profit. Because if you are just focusing on profit maximization, you're potentially thinking of cost cutting measures. So I'm looking at cutting costs such as employees, making them redundant. I'm potentially outsourcing. I'm potentially looking at these emerging economies where I know I can get away with cheaper labour rates. So the problem is with the shareholder approach is that it can be seen as unethical. And if you are just prioritising the short-term returns, maybe cutting costs, maybe not investing in product development and research and development, then is this a sustainable strategy over the long term? But then we've got our stakeholder approach. Now remember, a stakeholder is anyone, an individual or group or an organisation that has a level of interest by a business or is impacted by their decisions. So when I think about stakeholders, we've got our internal stakeholders or external stakeholders, your employees, the local community. Now, when I think of the stakeholder approach, we are trying to prioritise all of our stakeholders when we are making our decisions, not just the shareholders, even though shareholders are an example of a stakeholder group. So the aim is now we are not just focusing on maximising profits. We want to benefit all the stakeholders that we can. So what we want to do is we want to make sure we're maintaining communication with these stakeholders, consistently consulting with them on our decisions, what they think, what they would like to see from our business decision. And what's important to note is that your different stakeholder groups, their objectives may conflict with our shareholder objectives. First of all, think about your customer objectives. Realistically, customers, they want the best quality products at the lowest prices. So if they want the best quality products, the business has to invest more into the company, increasing costs. And if they want it at the lower prices, well, of course, we're going to have to reduce our prices. So costs are going up, prices are going down, our profitability, our profit begins to reduce. Now, of course, shareholders want the business to focus on profitability because they want more dividends. So we can see how they may begin to conflict with one another. Well, what about our employees? Well, if you think from an employee perspective, they want to be paid fairly. They want to be paid as much as possible, actually. They also want secure contracts. They want their business to show a level of interest into them, to develop them, to develop their skills, to invest in training. But this costs a lot of money. So if we're increasing the business's cost, potentially we may be looking at reducing profitability. And finally, well, what about our suppliers? Well, when we think about what your suppliers want, they want to be paid fairly. Once again, they want to be paid as much as possible as they can for their raw materials, for whatever they're supplying the business. And not only that, they want to be paid as quick as possible. So what that means for the business, trade payable days is a lot lower. Our costs begin to increase, and that can impact our cash flow and our profitability. The very last thing that we need to do now in this revision video is to take a look at technological change and how this has impacted businesses and their decision making. Now, when we look at technological factors, we're looking at technological advancements, the rate of innovation, the development of automation, new technologies that are coming out. For example, think of social media. Think of artificial intelligence. Because when we are looking at artificial intelligence, it's literally changing the way businesses are operating. Now, how this impacts businesses? Well, we can look at businesses who are operating in these technological industries, maybe a mobile phone producer. But what we have seen is that the rate of innovation, the rate of technological advancement is getting quicker and quicker. So what this does to their product life cycle is getting shorter and shorter because customers are expecting better products and they're expecting them a lot quicker. So there's more pressure now on businesses to innovate and to keep up with change. But not only that, it also transformed the way we produce our products and services. When we think about product production, well, all the automation, all the robotics that we've started to use in our operation and production processes has increased our efficiency. The level of productivity is increasing. So what happens? Your fixed costs are getting spread over more units, so unit costs can begin to reduce. And not only that, but the developments in technology has lowered the barriers to entry for businesses. So when we look at online businesses, well, to start up an online business, it's very easy. You just set up your own website and start selling the products or services that you have. Well, what about social media? 50, 60 years ago, it was a lot more difficult to advertise your brand. But now you can do it for completely free on social media. So what technology has done is that by lowering the barriers to entry, it's increased the level of competition. If you've enjoyed this video and want to continue your revision on Unit 7, I highly recommend you check out our video here, which will be part 3 of 3, and it covers the rest of Unit 7 that you need to know for your exams. And there are some very important concepts in that video, such as Porter's 5 forces and our different investment appraisals, such as the payback period, average rate of return, and net present value. I really do hope these videos have been helping you with your revision. Thank you so much for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.